Uh, um, so we are honored to have Dr. Naminata Diabate today with us. She's an associate professor of comparative literature at Cornell University, a scholar of gender, sexuality, and race. Her most recent work on literary fiction, cinema, visual arts, and digital media has appeared in a monograph, peer-reviewed journals, and collections of essays, including Journal of the African Literature Association, Journal of Contemporary African Art, the Routledge Handbook of African Literature, African Literature Today, ALT, Critical Interventions, Research in African Literatures, and Fieldwork in the Humanities. Her book, Naked Agency, Genital Cursing, and Biopolitics in Africa, was published by Duke University Press in 2020 and awarded the African Studies Association 2021 Best Book Award and the African Literature Association 2022 First Book Prize. This year, she holds the Ali Mazrui Senior Research Fellowship at the Africa Institute of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, working on two monographs, The Problem of Pleasure in Global Africa and Digital Insurgencies and Bodily Remains. Naminata, we're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. And because I'm currently in the Emirates, as Phoebe said, and it's 5 p.m. right now. So I would also like to express my gratitude to Dr. Sinfri Makoni for inviting me to be part of this vibrant and enriching forum. And I can also thank the African Studies Global Virtual Forum team, including Phoebe Quaynor and Chanel van der Mert for handling logistics. My reflections here take as the point of departure, the act of public disrobing as a form of conflict management, which many social media groups and many social movements have mobilized. In lodging grievances in the current climate, conventional models of participatory democracy, such as voting, lobbying, writing letters to politicians, seem to be ineffective. Defiant disrobing or genital cursing, as some call it in Africa, however, offers mixed results with the deleterious and salutary effects of the internet. Here, I meditate on how digitality disrupts the postcolonial reading framework that scholars have offered in the name of the empire writing back. So departing from that logic, I suggest another way of reading, which I call naked agency, and which highlights the ever unstable and unfolding nature of power relations. So in doing, I contribute to the ongoing debates on notions of subjectivity and agency by moving away from a postcolonial writing back principle and toward a post-postcolonial lens, or if you might want to play around, moving away from an anti-postcolonial standpoint. So that is, globally speaking, what I will try to achieve with you during the next 45 minutes. The paper is organized around 6 sections. Section 1 starts with a 2002 event in Nigeria and continues with the global trend of protest nudity. I follow that up with how the gesture is received and articulated in the African context. The fourth part explores postcolonial and other reading logics, which I contrast with the effects of the internet. And I end with my proposal of naked agency. So that's the roadmap. So now, here we go. Part 1. Niger Delta 2022. In July 2022, hundreds of female protesters in Nigeria occupied Texaco Chevron's export terminals and properties, holding hostage 700 American, British, Canadian, and Nigerian workers by threatening to get naked. The women demanded employment for their families and basic infrastructures, such as schools, hospitals, water structures, and electrical systems. Given that the event was about oil, major international news channels covered the incident to a mystified global audience. Eventually, the oil companies agreed to negotiate with the women, leading a journalist to claim, quote, "For the women, what started out as an act of desperation became a method to victory," close quote. Asked about their abilities to take men hostage without guns or heavy artillery, a spokesperson for the women said, quote, "Our weapon is our nakedness," close quote. In this drama of desperation, contestation, and negotiation, within an extractivist logic and mismanagement of natural resources, many increasing and intriguing questions arise. What is an African ritual nakedness on the global stage? How do we read notions of victory and weapons and so on? How enlightening can a postcolonial reading praxis be in this context? Global trend. Although this Nigerian strategy inspired others, including protests against the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, it also fits into a global trend. Since the late 1990s, insurgent nudity has proliferated worldwide. I have documented hundreds of collective instances in response to many issues such as globalization, capitalism, environmentalism, Black Lives Matter, land disputes, even the rise of Donald Trump, and more recently, during and against COVID-19. The proliferation of the act showed that it is less the last resort of oppressed minoritized groups than it's a global response to 5 major factors. One is economic dispossession, which all of us can easily understand. The second factor is the loss of faith in and rejection of conventional forms of political speech. The third factor that I identify is what Judith Butler has called precarity in frames of war, which is the politically induced condition of maximized precariousness for populations exposed to arbitrary state violence. The fourth factor that we can think of is that of the state of exception, a la Ngambe, where life is abandoned to corporate greed and stripped of most political and legal prerogatives. And finally, we can identify what Rob Nixon has called slow violence. That is the violence wrought by climate change, toxic drift, deforestation, oil spills, and the environmental aftermath of war that takes place gradually and often invisibly. So these are the kinds of factors that I propose account for the ways in which more and more activists resort to the nakedness. So although nakedness is visible because of the internet, it is by no means a new phenomenon. From antiquity to our current negative biopolitical era, from Germany to Mexico, from France to India, from China to Kenya, and from South Africa to the United States, various socio-political male and female actors have utilized resistant self-exhibition to prosecute conflict with opponents. In fact, uncivil nakedness is the most universal, although the most context-specific mode of dissent. Its deployment and reception are predicated upon a host of ways of thinking about sexuality, privacy, moral injuries, and other factors that transcend social sharedness. It is therefore naked agency, naked protest, that is, a classic case of the principle of what Richard Twedder has called universalism without uniformity. So how have Africans written about and accounted for in terms of naked protests? That's what I lay out in the third part, numbers and aestheticization. In the generalized African context, thousands of women from more than 25 countries have mobilized insurrectionary nakedness to punish elected officials, to signify vulnerability, to expose distress, or to enlist the support of national and international communities to their cause. These women are of all ages, educational levels, and occupations. There are widows, civil servants, mothers, street vendors, university students, young and elderly. The overwhelming number of events led me to design a map and a chart. This color-coded map shows 23 countries, with South Africa and Nigeria leading the way with the highest numbers of events involving female self-disrobing. There are follows by Côte d'Ivoire, but most countries fall in third and fourth places, some of which include Benin, Cameroon, Gabon, Ghana, Mali, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Togo, and so on. In my research, I uncovered written data spanning more than 10 decades. From the 1920s, the beginning of the colonial encounter, to the 2010s, the height of political awakening and vulnerability. But if we consider oral materials in many African languages, we can trace back the public appearance of naked protest to further back. For example, my native language, which is Malenke, oral narratives in that language trace back the little cursing in the public arena to the medieval era. So there is more work to be done by tracing the genealogy in the public space of female collective self-disrobing. Note the spiking numbers of the last 2 decades, 2020s, 2000 and 2020s. We can explain these spiking numbers by media penetration and democratization and the negative biopolitical era, which may turn out to be more brutal and lethal in some cases than the colonial. And I think that that's an interesting point that we can talk more about during the question and answers moment. Because, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, we realized that in 2012, more women died in the hands of Ivorian security and military services when they were protesting against electoral conflicts than women who protested against colonial authorities in 1959. During the 1959 demonstrations, no women was shot dead. But in 2012, dozens of women died. So what does that mean about the nature of the post-colonial state if it turns out to be more brutal than the colonial state in some, in some areas? So the chart and the map allow the ubiquity of the gesture to be powerfully articulated and deeply felt in a visual form. So given the potency of the gesture in conflict management, it is not unusual to find terms that ethnicities and nations use to designate it. So I have this table with the term in on my left column, and then we have the ethnicity and the country. So for example, if you look at, if we called the gesture, let's say naked protest in English, or genital cursing as anthropologists will call it, in among the Anlu, that's the third row, the term is called Anlu, the ethnicity is the Com, and the country is Cameroon. Or the fourth row, the term will be Mevungu among the Beti of Cameroon. But the Mevungu is both the term that of the secret society, the female secret society that organizes and performs the cleansing ritual. So the term both designates the society, but also the gesture. So this is to account for the complexity of this defiant disrobing, how different ethnicities have different ways of naming it. So the proliferation or the visibility of the gesture has given rise to a minimum of 5 aestheticized categories: films, novels, poetry and drama, visual art, and narrative film. And I'm providing this section, which is numbers and aestheticization, to account for the artistic restaging of naked protest and how different genres and platforms are bearing witness to defiant disrobing. In terms of documentary films, we had 3 films. We have the 1995 South African short documentary, To Walk Naked, about the women of Soweto who were protesting in 1990 against the destruction of their shops. The second one is the American Candace Schmelhorn 2010 documentary, The Naked Option, A Last Resort, which was in 2010. This, the Naked Option is about the women of the Niger Delta. And the last documentary is the American Abigail Disney and Jeannie Retiker's 2011 documentary, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which features the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize winner Lima Gbawi and the interfaith women in Liberia who were instrumental in ending the war. So if you think about it, all these documentaries have been directed and produced by quote unquote white American and white South Africans. So we don't have, at least my research has not shown these documentaries to be produced or directed by a Black African person. So there is something to be said about that. How we can have access, we can have visual access to these documentaries made not by the women who are the subject of the documentaries, but other people, quote unquote, other people. I know I'm being a little bit controversial here, but I hope you get the point. Now, there are 4 novels that restage events of naked protest. We have the Nigerian Obinkaran Echewa 1992 historical novel, I Saw the Sky Catch Fire. We have, that was 1992. And in 1992, we also have Clarissa Pinkola's Estes 1992, Women Who Run with the Wolves. In 2006, we have Ngungi wa Thiong'o's Wizard of the Crow. And in 2020, we have Jennifer Makumbi's novel, The First Woman. I didn't discuss all of this in the book, Naked Agency, but I'm bringing all this to your attention to say that there is more work to be done on this subject matter. In terms of poetry and drama, we have 2 Cameroonian artists. We have Kekuba Langmia's 2004 play, Titabe and the Tankumbeng. And we have, what is his name here? Peter Wakunta is actually a scholar. And he wrote this play collection of poems called Takumbeng and Other Poems from Abakwa. And the Takumbeng is a female secret society in some parts of Cameroon that often perform cleansing rituals. And I think 2009 and 10 already, they were active on the political scene in Cameroon, which gave rise to these 2, to this poem and this play. Now we have a narrative film by the Nigerian Moses Esquire called 1929. This is a fictionalization of the 1929 Igbo Women's War, which the novel, I Saw the Sky Catch Fire, also restages. Now there are a number of visual artworks about the subject matter. We have American Sepp Topokman with his comic strip, Nakedness and Power. This is about the 1992 women in Kenya, in what is now called the Freedom Corner protest. We have Pauline Seka-Jugo and his artworks and exhibition called The Feast of Stella Nyanzi, which is reflecting on Stella Nyanzi's 2016 protest against being locked out of her office at Maizre in Uganda. And we also have 3 different representations by the Nigerian scholar and artist, Bruce Ono Brakweya. And the artwork is called Nude and Protest. So I was interested in this specific artwork, not just because it frames and reimagines naked protest by women in the Niger Delta, but why the artist decided to restage this, over years. The first painting, which was a plastographic piece, came out in 1994. And then one came out in 2007. And I also found one which is on my right-hand side here in 2016. And I have to say that the dating of these artworks is not always accurate, but there is something to be said how the art is always reimagining differently how the women are presented. So we can, go back to this piece because I think it's very telling. So the artworks that I have just shared with you, these mediatized texts, all celebrate the prowess of militant females in South Africa, Cameroon, Nigeria, Liberia, Uganda, and Kenya. The narratives address a wide range of issues, including human rights violations, misgovernment, and other forms of social ills that plagued post-independence African countries. So now, how have intellectuals, journalists, and commentators reacted to the proliferation of naked protest? I have identified 4 reading standpoints. So now I'm getting to part 4, postcolonial and other reading logics. The first reading frames the gesture as backward and the women as barbaric and lewd figures who are incapable of speaking the language of modernity. These comments come from Gambian religious leaders, Ugandan public officials, South African, Nigerian journalists and commentators, and Ivorian readers. The second reading interprets the women and their weapons as peaceful. For example, in 2012, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama said that about Ivorian women. And NGOs in Uganda also framed the women's gesture as a peaceful form of protest. And I talked some more about how that is detrimental to the women's initial goals. The third reaction comes from the women activists who inflate the efficacy of the strategies, as was the case with the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize winner, Lima Gbawi, whose threat to strip in 2003 contributed significantly to the end of the 14-year Liberian Civil War that created more than 3,000 refugees and displaced people and 300,000 deaths. So in the documentary, Play the Devil Back to Hell, Lima Gbawi has this to say, quote, 1, the peace talks were in Ghana, and the Ghanaians hold strongly to the traditional beliefs. And the men at the table mostly came from indigenous backgrounds and also held strongly to indigenous beliefs. They would have given us the world rather than see us stripping naked, close quote. But upon watching the documentary, one wonders if Lima Gbawi's self-aggrandizing rhetoric is actually accurate. The fourth and final factor, reading framework, comes from academics who celebrate figures such as Gbawi or the Nigerian women as sovereign subjects. The well-meaning postcolonial and decolonial writing back logics, which are anxious to correct the disempowering images in local and global media of African women are victimized as the traditions, and critically upholds images of women as powerful and a mode of contestation as uniquely celebratory. These scholars accomplish that by relying heavily on the cosmological and spiritual principle that underpins the gesture, thereby denying the practice the privilege of change. So this is, this slide shows the spiritual principles that the postcolonial writing back logic deploys. 1, the potency of women's fertility. 2, fear of senior women's sexuality. 3, prohibition against incest. And incest is committed when males look at elderly women's exposed bodies. And onlookers are guilty by association as they are expected to go naked in solidarity with the women's cause. And finally, the targets of the women's gesture are ostracized because people fear being associated with such a crime, incest, and the resultant social stigma. So according to this story, women genitalia house both beneficent and maleficent entities that are endowed with the power to give and take life. There's through genital cursing, the women are said to be unleashing the forces that reside in their bodies, causing the male targets a myriad of misfortunes. These include impotence, infertility, incurable diseases, and literal and social death. It is the putative potency of the gesture that makes it, according to postcolonial scholars, the most feared of all female-resistant gestures. Such a reading was marshaled in the 2010 documentary, The Naked Option, A Last Resort, in which an historian explains the potency of the gesture. So this documentary features some of the women who participated in the 2002 threat to strip naked against multinational oil companies. So I will have you watch 2 minutes and 30 seconds of this documentary. And pay attention to what the historian will say at the end. It's
Niger Delta is in crisis. Oil pollution, air pollution, gas flare, and the oil companies and the federal government are directly involved in all of this.
The women of the Niger Delta, they have systematically watched their sons and daughters killed by security forces just to allow the multinationals to take away the oil.
You produce 100% of the country's wealth, yet you don't even have a cup of clean drinking water.
All their waters are polluted. No fish grows there anymore. They are all dead.
Since when Chevron come, my children they hungry. My husband they hungry. My brothers they hungry.
They're all the same, but Shell is the leader. Shell operates as a state within a state. Shell is a country all on its own in Nigeria.
When this awareness have not come to us, they really cheat us to death, the company. They cheat community to death.
Since the oil companies have refused to respond to the men, we feel it is time for the women to step in.
If women organize to carry out anything, they are unstoppable and devastating.
They have taken everything that we own. We must take it back.
In the year 2002, because of the long deprivation, the community women then staged a protest.
We not understand the area when we say we drive at the but now we come to say no, this thing what we even they do so safe. And this our town we so we get milk and honey for this our town, which is the oil.
If anybody goes and says stop the functioning of the flow station, it's daring government. And when you dare government can decide to flush you out by force.
We are not living here until the MD of Chevron will come. It will take a year, months, we don't care. We'll be here, this is our land. It's just the equipment that belongs to Chevron.
It is taboo in our land for our mothers to say that they will go naked. That means that every means of protest has failed.
We go naked, we go there on naked, because you people want me to suffer, and the way to see from inside, they cannot take like that. Fear them.
So, of course, this is a jam-packed excerpt, and I all encourage you to watch the documentaries, to actually watch the free documentaries that I brought to your attention. They're very telling about women's resources and then their determination to fight back against all kinds of extractivist logics, both from local but also foreign actors. So the question here for me is, what does it mean for something to be taboo in our land, in the current ecosystems, where images travel at the speed of light and across the globe? What is the land? Where is the land situated? So by disavowing the trope of Africans as simple and functional subjects, in an attempt to restore them discursively as intentional actors, the postcolonial writing back model ends up not only overlooking the kinds of violence, epistemic and as well as physical, that insurgent nakedness begets, but also ignores the evanescence of positions of power, thus reifying the dichotomy between triumph and victimhood. In this schema, the women are endlessly powerful, even in the absence of tangible data to ascertain the realization of their desired outcomes. But there are 5 factors. I'm coming up again with one more list. There are 5 factors that showcase the weakness in the postcolonial reading back logic. It designates all events of public disrobing in Africa as genital cursing. It features a dyadic dynamic, the women and the targets, with the implication that the collective entities, the women and the targets, show no possibility of internal dissension. All the women constitute a collective and they all think alike, they act alike. There is not a possibility that they're different. So there is something interesting about that framing of collectivities. The third factor is that it frames the gesture as anti-patriarchal and predating colonialism. And yet patriarchy is understood as the product of colonialism. So there is a tension here, how patriarchy is understood within the context of genital cursing. And lastly, it relies heavily on the cosmological, indigenous, religious, and spiritual principles, which I explained earlier, such as fear of senior women's sexuality, shame as a structuring principle. And so by consigning the gesture to this religious and spiritual context, that reading denies the gesture the privilege of change. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about 1920s Igbo land or 2020 city in Nigeria, the gesture is supposed to be the same. So we're not allowing that gesture to breathe. We're not giving it the privilege to take in meaning or to shed off sound. But we also have to remember that the meanings that are being assigned to the gesture, like the ones that you have on your screen right now, these meanings were mostly collected during the colonial era by anthropologists and ethnographers. Of course, they were mostly European and American, and they were male ethnographers. Mostly, there were some female ethnographers. So what does it mean for our postcolonial reading to be drawing on this ethnographic data, which were collected in the ways in which they were collected? And we all know the debate about anthropology. So how do we make sense of that possible tension? So although useful, the writing back logic doesn't serve us well. It locks us in the logic where all supposedly share the same episteme. It focuses on the snapshot of the event, leaving out its journey and the encounter that will shape the women's initial goals. Casting naked protest in the key of spirituality, this reading seems oblivious to the backlash against the gesture, which ranges from legal threats, slander, humiliation, verbal attacks, deportation, physical brutality, arrest, and even murder. Considering this backlash along a relentless waves of slippages, confusion, and often inconsistent responses and misappropriations, which globalization and the ubiquity of the internet and instant communication amplify, we are obliged to rethink and reformulate agency. To do so, I suggest another logic, that of a post-postcolonial or an anti-postcolonial reading optic, which I called naked agency. My suggested logic is even more imperative because of 7 factors. As I mentioned, one more list. So section 5, the internet and other determining factors. One factor is the cultural and ethnic diversity in most African cities, with the faster disintegration of kinship ties that enforce a certain kind of agency to women's targets. 2, the dynamic cycle of contestation and instrumentalization that denies the women some form of agency and responsibility, whereby the women figure as puppets in the hands of all powerful structures. If the women were to protest, let's say today in Abidjan, you will have some members of the community come forward and accuse the women of being instrumentalized by an opposing side. So that reading denies women any kind of agency. So it seems that they're just puppets in the hands of factional political positions. Of course, we have the rhetorical patronizing and physical backlash that I mentioned earlier. So, a factor that is really crucial and which had escaped previous readings of the gesture is the need for mediators and translators in collective meaning making. In the absence of the women's rationals, often reporters must rely on cultural brokers in order to share the women's grievances. Because often the women, because of the secret aspect of their ritual, they refuse to talk to bystanders or journalists. And often they don't have banners explaining why they are protesting and what their ultimate goals are. So all we often see will be exposed, taboo body parts. So for journalists and reporters to make sense of the event, they have to approach what I call mediators and translators. And often these translators inject their own agenda within the explanation. So we have to take into account that figure. 5 is the misinterpretation of the women's gesture as effective non-violent strategy. How can an approach that the women consider as their most powerful weapon that can cause the deaths of their target be codified as non-violent? Then we have the 6th factor is the naked protest fatigue and the silence in major international news network that now refrain from covering this event for perhaps ethical concerns. The silence seems to have emboldened dubious websites in search of large readerships and ads. These websites have recently become the site of appearance of the women's aggressive nakedness. So before, because of the exceptional nature of the gesture, major news, both international and national news network will cover events that include naked protest. But now, nobody seems to be covering these events. So you only have dubious websites on the side without any concern from the women's nakedness, privacy. They're the sites of appearance of naked protests. So there is something to be said about that naked protest fatigue. And finally, the 7th factor is the sharing affordance of the internet with the misuse of women's images of women's nakedness. As these images travel through time and space and across media, platform and languages, contradictions develop as to the texture of their agency, which is both emerging and subjected. So it is to account for that journey that I propose the term naked agency in terms of open agency. So now I'm getting to the final section of this talk, 6, naked agency. So the term designates the incessant negotiation of power relations between the women and the targets and other stakeholders, near and far, today and in the future. This dynamic can best be understood in terms of openness or figurative nudity. As such, the concept alludes to the unsolicited yet generative encounter between African local cosmologies about exposed bodies parts, Africanized political institutions, and dominant accounts of nakedness as a state of vulnerability and innocence. The concept highlights the dynamic and even the triadic dynamic between the women and the targets, and an even proliferating set of figures, such as translators, artists, observers, and other figures. Naked agency also highlights how the gesture becomes multiple things each time it travels temporally and spatially. The number of interpretation it accrues depend on how far and fast on which digital media platforms the images land. So to conclude, let me circle back to the 2002 threat to disrobe, with which I began. Over the years, news reports and commentators continue to meditate on the event and its implication for direct action around the world. Mediated genres such as documentaries, visual art, stage performance, and fiction also continue to deliberate on the event by reimagining and restaging it. As the initial performance takes various forms, it accrues as well as shared soft meanings. The number of its stakeholders also increases as the dissemination of these forms implicates all of us as readers, viewers, witnesses, and commentators. Thus, we all become participants in meaning making, regardless of the women's initial intention. Thinking this defiant disrobing in the key of spirituality in African cosmology, as evident in the postcolonial and decolonial orientations, is to uphold the claim of African exceptionalism. Such understanding sets African women's body parts apart from others, denying the former the privileges of sharing humanity. That postcolonial riding back logic is not serving us. Instead, it continues to expose our sterile struggles with the colonial. Let me say this again, because it's very important. That postcolonial riding back logic is not serving us well. Instead, it continues to expose our sterile struggles with the colonial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naminata, for your presentation. I would now like to invite Makoni to initiate the conversation with you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rafael. I think if you can set the screen so that we can all see each other now. Okay, thank you very much for this very fascinating conversation. I want to begin with a very mundane question. Then as the conversation goes, we can get into some of the more philosophical debates. The first one is a very mundane one. what is a protest? Conceptually, from the way you are dealing with this, what is a protest? Because one of the notions that keeps coming up in your presentation is the idea of a protest. What is a protest? Is there a typology of protest? Because once I've got that, I can then begin to understand where I may fit in issues about naked agency.
Thank you so much, Professor Makoni. I understand protests as a dynamic where there are competing claims.
Mm-hmm.
The reasons for the competing claims may differ,
mm-hmm.
but as long as you have an event whereby multiple actors
mm-hmm.
are making claims and are in the business of solving and managing that difference, for me, that would constitute protest.
Okay, right. Now let me then move on to a question that is that reflects my lack of knowledge about history. The impression I get is that these protests where women are naked are largely or exclusively organized, and the protagonists there are women. Is there in the history of this type of research instances where you have got a combination of naked women and either dressed men or naked men as well joining together in a protest? Or this, by the time we get to naked protests for women, this is just now exclusively a female domain?
I mean, the context that I look at, primarily the African one,
mm-hmm.
I was focused on the female, the collective female aspect of it. But there are instances, especially during wars. I mean,
mm-hmm.
the Liberian War is an example of that. When you have warriors stripping naked for a variety of reasons, and historians who have looked at the Liberian War said that the warriors were stripping naked for spiritual reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So, because there was power housed in their bodies. So by stripping naked, they were cursing their male opponents. But when we look at at a longer historical arc and a larger geographic
mm-hmm.
area, it's not exclusively a female prerogative.
Okay.
It is both male and female. But in the African context, we seem to have the female principle be the one that is privileged
uh-huh.
to deploy it. And I'm using the word privilege because in close-knit societies, not the big cities that we have today, not all women could strip naked.
Mm-hmm.
You had to have a certain standing in the community. You have to be part of, quote unquote, the secret society, a term that was handed to us. So it was not the prerogative. However, you could not just strip naked.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be allowed. Your standing had to allow you to do so. So it's not a one-fits-all of understanding.
Okay. I know two sets of questions which I want to pursue with you to help me clarify something for myself. Is nakedness and nudity in these frameworks that you are dealing with, are they interchangeable or they are different? If somebody is nude, are they naked? If somebody is naked, are they nude? Or these are different? Do they mean the same thing in the universe that you are creating? What I'm trying to work out from a very sort of parochial linguistic perspective, I'm trying to pin down the meanings, what these words mean for me, coming across as an unrepentant linguist. Is nakedness and nudity, are they the same or are they different? And and if they are different, what are the political ramifications of maintaining a distinction between nudity and nakedness?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question. It's one more insightful question. For the layperson, nude and naked are interchangeable. But if we look at the etymology of both terms, we see that they're different. Like, for example, we know that nudity comes from the Latin, nudus. So it has that cultural connotation of sophistication. And we typically talk about the nudity in artworks, visual artworks. Typically the term nakedness, we don't say that this painting features a naked figure. We say that it features a nude feature because there is this oral sophistication, this Latinization and its cultural cachet. And the term, naked, which comes from the German naked, I'm jumping like a long historical arc in terms of etymology, comes from the German, and it is supposed to be vulgar. So the term naked, you don't use that term to designate sophisticated artworks. So, but in my work here, although I identify the differences between them, but I use both terms interchangeably with the understanding that they have different cachet, depending on who's using them and the area of intervention. In art, for example, it's not normal to call an art naked.
Now, I have two last questions, but the one question, towards the end, I didn't get your conclusion very well. Is your argument that the post-colonial critique, which seeks to frame Africa as exceptional, is a sterile argument? Is that the argument you are making? That post-colonial critique, and to some extent then decolonial critique, has invested too much time in seeking to establish exceptionalism, so thereby it is colonial. Is that the argument? Is that the core of the argument here?
Yes, and I know it's a
I'm just trying to
controversial one, especially the context in which I'm intervening. Southern epistemologies.
We don't have beliefs about anything here. I'm just trying to work out. I'm interested in getting to know the different viewpoints. That's why I'm trying to work out what the core of the argument is, because that is the part that I found quite fascinating.
Yes, I think I moved away from being nuanced to be super because I think, the book is much more nuanced, and I'm realizing that it's probably being misunderstood. So I think I have to put in the bluntest way possible. The postcolonial reading logic is not serving us. It's not serving us. It is obliterating many aspects that it's denying us the possibility of complexity. That's, for me, it's denying us, because the postcolonial writing back logic, it's a noble goal. And it has served as academia for decades. But I think for something as important as naked protest, and I'm not going to use genital cursing because I think it's very specific. Not all events of naked protest on the continent should qualify as genital cursing. So, but I'm going to use the more neutral term, naked protest. Not all of them should be celebrated, because by celebrating them, we forget sometimes the before, the during, and the after regrets that some of these actors experience. And when you look at the documentaries, for example, like the 1995 South African documentary about the 1990 event, 5 years after these academics went and talked to the women, and the women said, we regret it so much. And I said, one said, now I have to explain to my grandchildren why my nakedness is out in the world. Many in our communities chastised us for stripping naked. One said, I just didn't want to show myself, during, I didn't want to be, in the front row because my husband would have divorced me. So there was a deep sense of regrets. So my issue is, if we take the long durée,
yes,
not just the event, but if we think about the ways in which the event travels and the different interpretation and uses that the event accumulates, then we need to be much more nuanced rather than celebrate one snapshot. So that's really the argument. The argument is to take seriously the journey of the gesture from initial to quote unquote completion, because there is no completion anywhere. 100 years from now, we may have artists reimagining these events. So for me, it's about the longue durée. And when we take into account the longue durée, we have to be less celebratory. Because we are in academia, in a process of knowledge production, it's not necessarily that we also have to be militant in writing back against the West. For me, it's about talking to my fellow scholars about, probably we need to dial down here and be a little bit more, perceptive. That's the argument.
Okay, I agree with you. I like the idea of the longue durée, getting to know what the discussions were before the struggle, in the struggle, and the post-struggle. I like the way you have outlined intellectually, methodologically, how you proceed about this. Whether the conclusion you arrive at, I agree with it, it's immaterial. That you are interested in, let's say, some post-colonial readings, but you then embed them in a discussion about naked agency, then you come up with whatever decision. Why that is important methodologically is that unless you know philosophically how the individual, what steps they went through, at times it is difficult to understand the conclusions that they arrive at, right? And that's why I like the idea that you explicitly state your interest in naked agency and protest in post-colonial readings, then you go through that and you look at protests in different parts of the world. That's why you come up with universalism without uniformity. So, because I can see where you're coming from and how you went about it, I can then understand your conclusion. It's completely immaterial what I think about your conclusion. But what is important is that I understand your thinking, the thinking behind the conclusion. Because unless we understand thinking behind our own intellectual processes, then the discussions and conversations will become meaningless. Having said that, I must keep my mouth shut and hand over to Raphael. Thank you very much. That was a very useful conversation and presentation.
Thank you. Very perceptive questions.
Thank you.
I've never had these questions before.
Oh,
no.
Thank you.
Absolutely. No, nobody has ever asked me, I mean, the question of naked and nudity, yes, but what is protest? No, nobody has ever asked me to. So I was really happy to get to play with my possible answers.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. People have been very active in the chat box. So, so far there are 5 people who'd like to ask questions or make comments. Vishnya, Michael, Magda, Mohammed, and Mari. And I saw that just now Sali Koku raised his hand. So we have 6 people and about 20 minutes for the Q&A. So we'll start with Vishnya's question. She starts by thanking you very much for sharing these important stories and data with us, Professor Diabate. Can you say more about the definition of incest in the Nigerian context? I think you mentioned that incest in that context involves looking at women's naked body. I'm interested in learning more. Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you. And again, I should clarify that these are coming from ethnographic accounts, and it's been I guess since I'm not an historian or ethnographer, I haven't gone to the region to ask folks how they will define incest. So with that understanding, it is looking at another woman's genitalia. That's what they constitute as incest. And of course, the concept of incest is just so complex because it depends on the society. What can be considered incestuous in one context may not be so in another context. I'm a Malinke from Cote d'Ivoire, and there is a marriage between cousins, which is totally allowed and is actually celebrated. But in that will be looked at differently, will be considered incestuous in another context. So yes, looking at another woman's genitalia, especially if she's old enough to be your mother, that is considered incestuous. That's why those who are guilty of such a crime are ostracized. And that ostracism often lead to social death and also literal death, because how do you survive in the society when you feel so ostracized? So yes, that's how I can respond to that.
Thank you. Next, we have Michael, who starts by saying that he doesn't wish to be purely celebratory, but this has been truly wonderful. And then he goes on, I wonder if Dr. Diabate can elaborate on the identified need for mediators and translators. Are there examples or models, however flawed they might be, that she can refer us to?
Yes. And this idea, when I started the project, I didn't have the concept of translators and the concept of concentric circles, how as the event travels, we have more and more participants in interpreting and restaging and what have you. Often, the women during their rituals refuse to talk to journalists or any other person for that matter, because they consider their ritual to be sacred. For example, in 2012 in Uganda, during land disputes, women stripped naked, and they were so destroyed. They were very elderly. So the ministers had gone to the region for land demarcation, and the demarcation was supposed to carve out some land for multinationals who were supposed to create game parks and what have you. So the women, after lodging multiple forms of protest, finally resorted to stripping naked when the minister arrived on the ground. So the women were naked, they were rolling on the floor in the dirt and what have you. And of course, there was no journalist at that specific moment who could ask the women, what are you doing this for? And the women were screaming in their local languages that, of course, not all Ugandans can understand. So in reporting this to the national audience, the reporter had to refer to academics. So they went to the University of Makerere, asked the women, the chair of the Women's and Gender Studies, to explain this to the readership. So that scholar now becomes a mediator because she becomes a figure whose own agenda gets injected, who inflates the meanings of women's gestures, who gives the long genealogy, where the women are coming from, what does this mean, what that this doesn't mean, this is not about prostitution, this is not voyeurism, this is this and this and this and that. So for me, we need to take seriously the intervention of that translator, that cultural broker, who in this case is an academic. What is my role as an academic in explaining this to the larger audience? So those are the figures that I called mediators and translators. And of course, artists are also mediators and translators, because if we think about the artwork, the feast of Stella Nyanzi, that art is a mediator, because the event took place at Miser on campus, and it was publicized through YouTube, because somebody called me, oh, are you on? I say, yes, I'm in my office. Oh, just go to YouTube right now. Stella Nyanzi stripping naked. The person knew that I was writing a book on it. And I immediately went to YouTube and I saw it live. So now the artist, a few months after, comes out with these artworks. So that's a mediator, because of that platform, more people have access to Stella Nyanzi's naked protest. And the ways in which the artist reimagines the event also adds meaning to it. So, I mean, anytime you read a news report about naked protest, be on the lookout for that cultural broker, that translator, because they're always in there.
Thank you. And then next we have a comment from Magda, who wanted to share that the Waorani women in Ecuadorian Amazonia fight against the oil companies with spears. They are community leaders and are feared by many. Although they do not use naked agency, their presence as female fighters paralyze the neoliberal forces. Would you like to respond to that in some way, Naminata?
So that although the women were not naked, but they were affecting, paralyzing the operations. Yes, and I think, you know, I think nakedness calls attention, but it's not the most powerful aspect of a collective female contestation. The sheer anger, the sheer determination, for me, is often more important than anything else, because the emotional charge that the women, and the determination not to budge, even there were to be a bulldozer, I am not budging the niche. For me, that's often more important than the nakedness. Of course, you know, the disrobing is compelling, because that means that sometimes the person is ready for anything, but it's not the most important. So I can see how that sheer determination, that resolve, that I am not moving, is enough to ward off some of these forces. Yes.
Thank you. For those of you who might have missed it, Magda also shared the link with where you can find a photo of the women in Ecuador and Amazonia that she referred to. So thank you for that, Magda. Next up, we have a couple of questions from Mohammed. The first one is, please comment on the links for your project. Sorry, please comment on your links of your project with Feman movement. And then the next, if you refer little to the role of religion in forbidding such a type of protest, for example, Islam and Christianity in Africa. Has such protest been popular more among women belonging to non-monotheistic religions? Thank you.
No, thank you. That's a useful comment and question. Often, how do I phrase this? Because I'm originally from Cote d'Ivoire, so that's the context that I'm most familiar with. Naked protest is often deployed by women by Christian women. Because in Cote d'Ivoire, you have the northern part, which is mostly Muslim, and then the southern part, if you have to divide the country into two, the northern part is Muslim, and the southern part is Christian, because that's where, you know, explorers arrive through, you know, the sea. So naked protests often have been found to be deployed by women from the southern part of the Ivory Coast, who are mostly Christian. So I have not found women from the northern part, who are often Muslim, deploy it. Although I have to say, like in our households, even my mother sometimes threatened us, you know, that she was going to strip naked, but not in the public arena, not in a collective way. So now if we go to Nigeria, we see that Christian women are much more vocal in denouncing the use of nakedness. If we go to the Gambia, both Muslim and Christian are scathingly criticizing naked protest because they think that it's backward, it's barbaric, it's anti-Muslim, it is anti-Islamic, it's anti-Christian. So it's not a one-fits-all kind of response. Depending on the country, you may have this or that response in terms of religious affiliations and what have you. Femen, I have seen lots of articles on Femen. It's not, I am aware of their work and the impact of their work. I haven't engaged it. They're very powerful. They are successful in making themselves seen and heard, because there are many protests that would not have made it to our attention had non-Femen members been on the ground and flashing. So yes, but often their bodies are not the type that we see emerge in the African context, because typically Femen members are being criticized for being the beautiful body types, slim, white, young, whilst often what we see in the African context, and even the Black Lives Matter in the United States, these are quote unquote normal bodies with wrinkles and what have you. So that is the major difference between Femen but the investment in the political investment is absolutely real, and they do make inroads in terms of bringing their causes to our attention.
Thank you very much. I will now ask Mari's question, who starts by saying that it might be just a tangential matter. So she says that she was curious about how you interpreted the three images of naked disrobing. Why is it that in the third image, many women were covering their bodies with their arms? Any semiotic significance of this protective gesture?
I think that's, we need to, that's what I'm thinking. That's my reading. But that's not how we will see it. I can pull it up so that we all can look at it because it's very significant.
Thank you.
Okay. The 1994 artwork. This can be interpreted in various ways. The women can be protecting themselves, or they can be signifying their resolve. Because probably by doing this, by doing that, it's not in a protective mode, but it's more in a defiant and resolved mode. So there are multiple, that's why it is so beautiful, these artworks and the kinds of work that they do, because they really allow us to be a little bit more perceptive. Because we really have to look at these women row by row and see the position, where are they all looking at? Do they have the same body language? Why is this one distracted and this one seems more focused? Because if we look at the second row here, we see that it seems that these two women are hugging. Why are they hugging? Is it because one is distraught and one needs to comfort her? So it's very interesting. So, but I think there are two possible ways of looking at the women's hand gestures. Either resolve or protection, self-protection. And then when we look at the red line experiment, the one in the middle, the women seems to be a little bit more physically active. They're either dancing, when I mean dancing here, not in a joyful way, but they may seem to be uttering some incantations. when we look at the oil drawing, the black and white, they seem to be very still, resolved, but very still. So my question, was to what is the artist trying to do with these different renderings? So, but that's a great question. Probably the person has some insight that they want to share with us now that I've shown the image one more time.
Thanks. And then we have Salikoko, who would like to make an intervention himself. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this stimulating presentation. I really appreciate the significance of cultural embedding in making sense of nakedness. I'll start with two anecdotes. One is about 20 years ago, I was having a conversation with a Jamaican colleague of mine, and she pointed out to me that in anthropology, it's so common to see book covers with pictures of naked African women or non-European women, and nobody is bothered by that. But if anybody ever tried to put a picture of a bare-chested white woman, it would cause an uproar because people would see it as pornographic. And another, it tells you where you are and how you interpret things and what attitudes you have to the other's body. And of course, a lot of anthropologists are white, you are of European descent, and I can see the point of this Jamaican woman. But the other case is that I grew up in the Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in a semi-urban area. And when I was a teenager, I went to the village on vacation. And the first morning I woke up and I stepped outside and I was in shock. And everybody that noticed it laughed at me. I was in shock because I saw all these bare-chested women there talking with each other, and some of the women were also teenagers. And this is something that I had never seen in the urban center. And they had to explain to me that doesn't matter in the village. That is how people do it. And there is no sexuality in it unless it's all in your mind. So I felt so ridiculed by this thing. On the other end, I also learned that there are limits. It's only the upper part of the body and not the lower part of the body. So you don't see the genitals of these women. But women use their genitals to disavow members of the family and curse them. So the worst curse that a child can have in a family is to see the mother expose their nakedness and say, you are no longer my son or you are no longer my daughter. Because in order to solve the problem, it's going to require a village council to, determine what is going on, how to resolve the issues, and so forth. And this is the way it is all situated in this particular culture. Now, thinking of your protest, who were the people whose reactions were counted on during the protest? The Westerners that have these companies, or the local administrators that could then talk to the Westerners and tell them the significance of the message in seeing naked women protesting against what they were doing.
Yeah, thank you for this these anecdotal remarks. They're useful because they put these things into context. Yeah, in the Niger Delta 2002 Niger Delta event, it is unclear whether the women initially went there to strip naked. They actually went there to occupy the export terminals. And it's when the police moved in to dislodge them that they threatened to strip naked. And these police officers and security agents, being Nigerians, of course, backed off. And the women moved in even further and blocked entrances and exits from the offices. So of course, the sheer number could have prevented there's both Nigerian and foreign workers. The sheer number could have done the work. And what if security and military forces, not because they were afraid of women's possible nakedness, but because in some way they were citing the women's grievances, decided not to dislodge them. So there are so many possibilities why, quote unquote, the women's nakedness was their weapon, because it would have probably been a bloodbath if they had tried to move the women out, because there were, I think, hundreds and hundreds of women, and more were pouring in. So the short answer is it's unclear who the women's targets were, but I'm assuming they were targeting foreign workers. I mean, the multinational oil companies, also their own local leaders, because those are the ones who have opened, I mean, the gates of their countries and the community to these foreign companies. So, but for that spokesperson to say our nakedness was our weapon, I think it needs to be questioned. And of course, they eventually reached a deal with the companies, but nothing on the ground changed. And the content of that agreement has never been made public. But they were protesting to get certain infrastructural elements which never materialized. And they decided to end the 7-day standoff because they reached an agreement. Nobody knows the content of that agreement. The things on the ground have never changed. Is that still victory? I'm just inviting us to be a little bit more, to put a little bit of pressure on those aggrandizing statements.
Or did they use their bodies, their naked bodies, as a protective shield so that the police cannot touch them? You cannot touch the body of an adult naked woman without becoming, without it turning into a violation, even if you are applying the law, exercising the law. And then, they made them fear to even move forward, as the police wouldn't approach them anymore. And I have heard of stories where what militia just put the weapon down and fled when they saw naked women approaching them. Is that a possible interpretation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Each context brings its own specificity. In some contexts, yes, that may be enough to ward off, the opposing party, the opposing party. In the other context, that incites more violence. And that's what we saw in Cote d'Ivoire and other places. By the sheer fact of being naked, the men can say that I just got confused. So I just, fired out. So we have a multiplicity of responses. Yes, I totally agree with you. It can incite more violence, or it can quell violence. And the novel that I brought, the Nigerian offer, the novel, I saw the Sky Catch Fire, 1992, about the 1929 Igbo Women's War. according to historical records, the British historical records say, I think, gave the number of, I think, dozens. But the local reports gave numbers of hundreds of women who passed away, who died, because the women stripped naked as a collective. And the locals, called the Manchi soldiers coming from other areas of Nigeria, shot at the women. And according to the British archives, dozens of women died. And according to the locals, hundreds of women died. So you never know what the response that you're going to get. So my question is, let's not go into it thinking that we're going to be victorious, because this can incite more violence.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have unfortunately reached the end of our formal session today. I'd like to thank Vishnya, Michael, Madalena, Mohammed, Mari, Salih, for asking the questions or making your interventions. And of course, thank you once again, Naminata, for your presentation and engaging with all the questions and interventions in such an interesting way. I see that there are more people who have raised their hands or have written in the chat. And of course, they are welcome to keep the conversation going in the after party of our session, which is a part of our session that's not moderated. So now or soon I will take off my moderator hat and just continue with more informal talk. But before that, I'd like to ask Makone if you'd like to share some